My name is Sherry Philpott. I'm an OHS educational consultant with Workstation. And today I'm here with Ed Wade from OHS Division, Digital Government and ServiceNow. Today we're going to talk a little bit about working from home and the roles and responsibilities that go along with that. Before we get into the meat of the topic, I just want to remind you that if you feel the need to get up and move around, do so. We're all about micro breaks and getting our movement in for the day. So if you are feeling a little uncomfortable or if you just want to stand up for a while, go for it. It's not going to bother us in any way. Okay, so the traditional workplace is transitioning to a more working from home scenario for a lot of workers. Traditionally, we would be in the workplace all day, every day for our work schedules. But now we're moving to a more flexible schedules or more flexible situations where workers are allowed to work in places that are not the typical workspace, including places like their own homes. So we're going to go over some key things to think about when you're employing this type of worker, or if you're going to start implementing this type of situation in your workplace. We're going to look at the definition of what working from home is. We're going to talk a little bit about roles and responsibilities. Then we're going to discuss things to consider when developing your program. We're going to look at a work from home policy, as well as we're going to look at a checklist that would go along with your program. So first, let's start with what is working from home. So working from home is working from a pre-approved workspace, such as your home, that's not typically owned by the employer. So this space is something that's outside the traditional work area, and typically it is a place that is not controlled by the employer. So working from home may be temporary or maybe a more permanent contractual agreement. But either way, there are some things that you do need to consider, such as obligations that the employer and the worker would need to follow. So both the employer and the worker need to ensure the health, safety, and welfare of those that are working from home. And it's important that the employers and workers have a plan to keep their workers safe in the workplace. Workers should not be subject to a reduced health and safety standards just because they're not in your traditional workplace. So looking at the definition of what a workplace is, the NLOHS legislation states that a place where a worker or a self-employed person is engaged in an occupation and includes a vehicle or moving equipment used by a worker in an occupation. So essentially, anywhere that a worker is engaged in an occupation is considered a workplace as per our legislation, and that includes their own homes. So health and safety roles and responsibilities are just as applicable at home as they are in the more traditional workplace. Employers, supervisors, and workers are still held accountable for their respective responsibilities as outlined in the OHS legislation. However, the method in which these responsibilities are carried out may be a little different. Where reasonably practicable, employers and supervisors must protect workers' health and safety. Workers must take precautions to keep themselves safe, and a working from home policy outlines expectations of all parties and ensures everyone understands what they have to do. So what does reasonably practicable mean? The common theme throughout the general requirements is that you must do things that are reasonable to your situation. So reasonably practicable means that you are doing everything that you can do given certain circumstances. It must be something that is reasonable, attainable, and it has to be sustainable. So reasonably practicable has been described as taking precautions that are not only possible, but also suitable or rational given a particular circumstance. Determining what should be done is usually done on a case-by-case scenario. While workers may be out of sight while they're working from home, they should never be out of mind. Employers still have the general duty to ensure that their workers are healthy, safe, and their welfare is taken care of while they're at work. To avoid complications, a written agreement between the employer and the worker should be considered when doing working from home arrangements. Employers and workers have OHS responsibilities, whether they're working from home or if they're working in a more traditional workspace. Employers have the general duty to have a process to identify workplace hazards and to notify workers and supervisors of these hazards. They have the responsibility to control the risk of injury to their workers by having a process to remove the hazards or putting other measures in place. Provide instruction to workers in precautions to take to protect themselves and to protect the others that are around them. Supervisors have a general duty to advise workers of the hazards. They must ensure workers use their risk controls, such as their safe work practices and procedures, and they must provide written or oral instruction to workers on how to use these controls and how to protect themselves and keep others safe. Workers have a general duty to report hazards to the employer or the supervisor. They must partake in any training that's provided, and they also must implement any of the risk controls that the employer had put in place for them. Where an employer approves working from home, it should be expected that the location should meet the legislative definition of a workplace and that all applicable legislation and regulations will still apply, including things like hazard assessments, workplace inspections, and incident investigations. The Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety, or CCOHS, provides a list of things that employers should consider when developing a work from home policy or program. The list certainly is not an all-inclusive list, and each employer would need to examine their workplace and conduct a risk assessment to ensure that they encompass everything that they would need to. In addition to health and safety concerns, a thorough work from home program or policy would include things like what types of jobs or tasks can be done from home, whether the worker's regular conditions or employment would remain the same as previously, whether overtime would be allowed or whether their work schedule would change, the service standards, including deliverables and response time, as well as provisions and ownership of the working from home tools and equipment. You should also consider confidentiality and privacy of employment documents as well as personal information. Some health and safety considerations include risk and ergonomic assessments, injury and hazard reporting, inspections, investigations, safe work practices and procedures, meetings, emergency plans, as well as working alone or workplace violence. You will want to consider things like how are you going to conduct your workplace inspection, or how you're going to conduct your incident investigations, how you're going to ensure that incidents are reported. You want to look at if your workers will be expected to follow all of the same policies and procedures, safe work practices and procedures that you have in place for your in-person employees. You want to look at emergency plans as well as working alone procedures. You may also want to look at developing a simple ergonomic checklist that will help them to set up their workspace. To ensure compliance, it is recommended that the work from home policy addresses health and safety issues, including the nature, scheduling, and responsibility from working from home location, to include the inspections and hazard assessments. Workers must immediately report an incident or injury to the supervisor, just as they would in the traditional workspace, and participate in incident investigation process. So what does the employer need to do? The first step is to conduct a risk assessment. A risk assessment is the starting point. Find the hazards that are associated with your working from home office and evaluate the risk and put measures into place to eliminate hazard or reduce the risk to workers. To put this into practical terms, you must notify your worker on a process of how to identify hazards in their workspace. You want to consult with the worker to evaluate these hazards and to determine the risk level. And you want to help the worker identify appropriate control measures and ask them to verify that these measures have been put into place. Develop procedures for reporting hazards and incidents, as well as follow regular communication process. The best way to ensure that the employer demonstrates due diligence and that everyone understands their roles and responsibilities is to formalize these actions into a working from home agreement. Risk assessments are important to find and fix the hazards that are associated with working from home and to ensure workers have what they need to work safely. Employers may put a variety of controls into place to eliminate the hazards or reduce the risk to workers while they're working from home. These may include implementing a MSI prevention program, implementing a psychological health and safety program, developing communication methods, including processes for contacting the OHS committee or worker health and safety representative or designate. They may be supplying appropriate equipment, tools, or devices. It may be providing relevant information, training, or education. It may be reporting and investigating incidents that occur while working from home. It could include developing written procedures for checking on the well-being of the worker while they're working from home. And it could include making sure that the worker holds valid emergency first aid certificate, if reasonable to do so, or if required by an OHS officer. So your working from home policy should be developed and put into place, and it should include, information that will help you develop your procedure, or develop your program to put into place. It should be clear. It should be concise. It should include the evaluation as well as education. If not already in place, employers should introduce a working from home policy. This can be part of an existing OHS program or a separate initiative. The working from home policy should establish clear criteria for work from home arrangements to ensure that both the health and safety of the workers and compliance of NLOHS legislation. Prior to commencement of the work from home arrangement, all involved must be trained on general and issue-specific health and safety measures. The work from home agreement is a document used by workers and employers to define the roles and responsibilities at the start of their work from home arrangement. Although a work from home arrangement can be as basic or as detailed as the parties desire, the agreement should include essential information that, like names of both parties, the address of the work from home office. It should include a detailed description of their rights and responsibilities of the worker. Importantly, the agreement should specify the type of employment arrangement that the employer and the worker are agreeing to, such as, is this fixed or permanent? Is it temporary, full-time, part-time? In addition to describing the worker's job title and responsibilities, this agreement also allows the parties to define the worker's work schedule. The parties should describe how many days per week that the worker is allowed to work from home, the hours which they should be working and available to the employer, as well as other expectations about when and how the work should happen that has to be made clear to the worker before the job begins. Once the parties complete the agreement, they should both sign it, print it out, and keep it for their records. Keep in mind that this is not an inclusive of all issues associated with working from home. It is up to the employer and the worker to determine everything that would need to be put into your program and your policy and the agreement. Along with your working from home agreement, you should develop a working from home checklist. The employer can put together this checklist to help make sure that your employee has the appropriate methods or the appropriate control measures in place while they are working from home. This checklist should be based on a risk assessment and can include your work environment, communication, work practices, mental wellness, working alone, emergency preparedness and response, as well as training and workstation setup. When looking at work environment, you want to consider things like lighting, ventilation, temperature, equipment, layout and exits, and noise. A work environment or a work from home environment should meet the same health and safety standards as those available at the traditional workplace. It is important to have a proper setup to protect the health and safety of the worker. Communication is key to maintaining a health and safety and productive workplace. While working from home, there must be constant communication between the worker and the employer. When developing your checklist, consider what methods you will include for communicating with your worker. Make sure that you have a communication method determined, as well as figure out how you're going to maintain it and make sure that it is effective, and make sure that you set boundaries. You should establish and consider work practices based on your risk assessment. Some of these can include reporting hazards and incidents, as well as regular breaks away from the workstation. That could include your micro breaks and meal breaks, as well as regular check-ins with a supervisor or a team member. Next, you should consider mental wellness. So many workers who work alone, including those that work from home, can experience loneliness and isolation, anxiety, stress, and pressure, as well as depression. It is important to consider this when conducting your risk assessment and developing a working from home checklist. As per Section 15 of the Newfoundland and Labrador Occupational Health and Safety legislation, to work alone or in isolation means to work in circumstances where assistance would not be readily available to the worker in case of an emergency, or in case the worker is injured or in ill health, which means that the individuals are alone when they're working on their own. They cannot be seen or heard by any other worker and cannot expect a visit from another worker for some time, or where assistance is not readily available when needed. Although working from home may not always meet the true definition of working alone, it's important to consider this as the worker will be away from your traditional workplace and away from your site and your mind. Consider hazards specific to these homes and develop a plan and procedure to address hazards, specifically check-in procedures and how to get help if needed. Important questions to ask when determining if assistance is readily available include presence of others. Are other people in the vicinity? Awareness. Will people capable of providing assistance be aware that the worker needs help? Willingness. Is it reasonable to expect that these people will come and help this person? And timeliness. Will assistance be provided with a reasonable time, and how long will it take to get this person help? So your working alone procedure should include a check-in procedure, as well as it should include procedures for checking on the worker if they are not followed up on with their check-in procedure. So if they miss a check-in, you should have a procedure in place or a process in place where you would check upon that worker to make sure that they are still good to go. It is important that a check-in procedure is in place. Decide if a verbal check-in is adequate or if an email or text would be a better method. For most lone workers, the telephone may be their their lone source of contact. And if you're using a cell phone, just make sure that you are in an area that you have good coverage, or if there is not good coverage for your cell phone, that you make sure that you have an alternate method of communication. The risk assessment and the work from home checklist should encompass emergency preparedness and response. You need to consider what type of emergencies could happen or could potentially happen from the working from home work site. And you want to put in place items that would prevent or help respond to these emergencies. At minimum, you could consider a smoke alarm, fire extinguisher, emergency exits, evacuation plans, first aid kits, as well as emergency contact numbers. Employers are still required to provide education and training to their workers even while working from home. Using a risk assessment, you should determine what type of training and education that you are required to provide to your workers. While developing your checklist, ensure that you include these so that when you are filling it out or when the worker is filling it out, they can determine if they have that training or not. And then ergonomic setup questionnaire. So as an employer, you would need to provide instruction to workers on how to set up their workstation properly. The work from home checklist should include your ergonomic workstation setup questionnaire. This questionnaire should provide guidance to workers on how the workstation should be set up. As well, it should focus on the different items that they would have. So like they show them how to set up their chair as well as their monitor, their desk, all the items. And it should also consider how the worker interacts with these items. And lastly, your work from home checklist should include considering photographs. So ask your employees to submit photographs of their chair, their workstation. If they're going to be standing, make sure that you get a standing picture as well. You want to make sure that they are following the appropriate work processes or procedures or any sort of items that you have in place that you would need to them, like your controls that you put in place that you want them to follow. So we developed a working from home overview and checklist. We were hoping that it was going to be available for today for you guys to have. Unfortunately, it's not. However, I did include some screenshots of it to share with you today. And once it is available, I can share it with you guys through our registration list as well. So if you're having a look there at the first 3 pages, it's an overview of a lot of what we just talked about. It talks about doing a risk assessment, as well as including things like your working alone procedures. It talks about training, and talks about a little overview of how to do a program. From there, we move into a checklist. So this checklist walks you through all the items that we just discussed. There's work environment, there's communication, work practices. We've got mental wellness. We've got working alone, as well as our emergency preparedness and response. And at the end of the checklist, there's a section where you would sign off an agreement. So it's agreement and approval, or it's confirmation and approval. So the worker, the manager, and probably HR, depending on your workplace setup, would sign off on this agreement. And then we have our working from home checklist that includes the ergonomic setup. So I actually took this directly from a checklist that our MSI advisor, Cheryl Osborne, had developed for Move Well, Work Well Week. It's on our website now, actually, if you guys want to check it out. It's called Office Ergonomics Self-Inspection Checklist. So it walks through by body part on how to set up your workstation. So you look at your head and your neck, or it looks at your back and your legs, as well as your arms, wrists, and hands. And then it looks at some other items I can't see from here, but it, sorry. So it's a great tool to use. It'll walk you through how to set up your workstation. It's a checklist, simple yes and no's. You're obviously aiming for the yeses. And then there's another sign off on the end of this one as well to agree between the worker, the manager, and HR. So to sum up, I guess, what we all just went through, we talked about working from home. We defined what that meant. We talked about roles and responsibilities on the worker and the employer. We talked about developing a policy as well as contract considerations. And we talked about developing a working from home checklist. And I know I've been spewing a lot of information at you guys, but now is the time. If you have questions, you can come to the mic, or you can raise your hand and one of our runners will bring the mic to you. I've got my lovely assistant here, Ed Wade. He's going to help answer some of the questions you may have on working from home.
Oh, no, I don't think I need it. Do I need it?
You need to speak into the mic so that the people at home can hear you.
Let's say hi. Okay, so when it comes to doing the inspections and smoke alarms, fire extinguishers, stuff like that, is the employer supposed to buy it now if the person's working from home, or they should already have it in their house? How would that work?
Working alone or working from home, it's fairly new and it's ever emerging. I know it's for some employers, they've had working from home arrangements set up prior to the pandemic. So basically, as was discussed in the presentation, the main thing is conducting, identifying the hazards and controlling the risks from those hazards. So it's not intended for the employer to go in and refit everyone's homes with ventilation systems and smoke alarms and fire extinguishers and stuff like that. But it is the employer's responsibility to ensure that a proper hazard assessment is done and to identify all the risks associated with working from home. And we want to, through our risk assessment, we'll reduce the risks of the hazards that were identified. So yeah, so basically it's not up to the employer, but it is something that we should be questioning. And if homes are not fitted with this, well, then how do we control that hazard, which there's no, if the house catches fire, like how do we, like, you know, how can we assist the worker that's working from home to mitigate that risk from that hazard of not having a smoke detector or an operational fire extinguisher and stuff like that.
Hello?
Hi, so I just had a question about the jurisdiction that server personnel, excuse me, would have over those workplaces at home. So the jurisdiction is obviously an officer can come in at any point in time to our workplaces. So how does that extend to our remote locations?
So again, this is ever new and changing. But for now is that we would rely on the employer to be able to prove due diligence by ensuring that the proper hazards assessment was done to identify the risks of the individual new workplace, and that through documentation that the hazards have been controlled. So if there's an accident at home, well, again, that's in the learning phase of how we're going to deal with that.
I have a question from online. The first question is, where can I find an ergonomic checklist that Sherry spoke about on the Workstation website?
I can share a link later, but the easiest way to do it is to go on to the search bar and type in checklist. And there's 2 or 3 that'll pop up, and this one's called Office Ergonomic Self-Inspection Checklist.
Thank you. And one more question from online. Is it the employer's responsibility to provide all equipment, computers, monitors, keyboard, etc., to employees who are working from home?
Well, this again, I'm big on doing the hazard assessments and identifying the risks. So the employer need to provide the necessary tools for a worker to do their job or their tasks. So again, it's not to go in. We're not saying they got to go in and buy all brand new desks for everybody's houses and stuff like that. But if they need a computer or a laptop, it's possible they can take the one from their physical workspace, their physical current workspace, to their home-based office.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from the audience?
The the list that you provided is quite good. Word of warning, the word reasonable. You use it twice, reasonable accommodation and where reasonable. You're asking for trouble when you use that term.
Is that for the first aid requirement?
No, it's reasonable accommodation for workers with disabilities and where reasonable, practical employers was one of the first ones. The word reasonable can legally lead to enormous problems. And I would just drop the word altogether from your publicity stuff.
I think in some of the legislation it says reasonable and practical. Yeah.
Yeah, and it also says bona fide and good faith, and
Right.
therefore all the fights.
Duly noticed.
Okay, we have another question online. If someone has individuals in the home, are they still considered to be working alone?
Under section 15 of the occupational health and safety regulations, we define that if you're not with members of the workplace, you are working alone. So the employer has to do, again, big on the hazard assessments, identifying the risks of working alone, and ensure that the necessary policies and procedures put in place, checking in on the well-being at a designated time. So a risk assessment for a person that's working from home in an office type setting, that risk would be lower than someone, a maintenance guy that's climbing up ladders or something like that. So the check-in, check-on would be probably less for the lone worker in the home office setting. However, it still has to be done. So through the risk assessment, you'll determine the frequency of check-in, check-on. And then that also has to be documented. So in the event that something should happen, the employer can say, well, you know, our risk assessment said that we would check on the lone worker in the office setting at 8 a.m., mid-morning, noon, mid-afternoon, and at the end of the day. And based on the risk assessment, they felt that this was adequate. So, and that it's documented that they did check in and check on the worker. So yes, I guess the question is, the employer, even if you're home with your family, the employer still has a responsibility to know that you are safe.
Thank you, Ed. And we have one more question online, and then we're going to move up to one in the audience. Just to clarify, there is no requirement to complete inspections at the employee's home. The hope is to have employees who provide photos to confirm the workplace is safe in the employee's home.
So under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, everybody has a duty and roles and responsibilities for their own health and safety. So it would be expected through your workplace or working from home agreement that you would do your own workplace inspection. And if there was any issues, you would bring it back to the employer, whether it's through the employer's occupational health and safety committee or the worker health and safety rep or the designate. So yes, it's the employee's responsibility that's working from home. So that should be outlined in the working from home policy, like clearly should define that hazards have to be addressed. And then there should be a mechanism for them to bring their hazards forward to their employer.
Great. Thank you. And we have one more question here.
Sorry, I have another one.
Sorry.
What about incidents? I know we didn't get into it much, but if any incident, anything happens while you're working from home, it's a workplace incident. Like, you know, you get up, you trip over your dog, anything. I don't know, like, if you're in your work hours during that day, is that going to be accepted by workers' comp and be a workplace incident?
I won't speak to the workers' comp piece of it, but yes, it's because as you know, workers' comp's no fault insurance. But however, for incident reporting, it's critical that all incidents in a workplace be reported so we can learn from those incidents. So tripping over a pet, well, maybe not everybody got a pet, but maybe, you know, it could be communication. So yes, report all incidents and then, you know, make sure, well, the employer then has a responsibility to ensure that the incidents are reviewed, whether through their occupational health and safety committee, worker health and safety rep, or designate. And then, you know, it's looked at so we can learn from that incident so it doesn't become something greater.
Hi, Ed, just an extension to the reasonableness definition. For flexible work arrangements in most workplaces where somebody remains at home, they have a sick child or the weather is bad, and they simply decide on that day to work from home. Does the legislation apply to those circumstances as well? Do we have to put the same kind of controls in place? What's the expectation there? Reasonableness.
Reasonableness, again, yes, thanks, Tom. Yeah, no, reasonableness for sure, but yes, so that should be something that the employer has already considered. So if they're going to, if the workplace is closed due to inclement weather, well, the employer should already have an arrangement in place that if they're expecting the employees to work that day, that's everything that applies at the physical workplace also applies at the home office workplace.
And we have one more on this side of the room.
Hi, I was just curious, does it have implications for your homeowner's insurance if your home is your work site?
I'm not able to answer that. That might be something you might want to check up with your homeowner's policy. So yeah, I'm not sure. That's sort of outside the legislation. So it's but it may affect your homeowner's policy. Yes, that's a very good question.
Hi, quick question. Kind of alluding to what everyone's asking. So if the worker can't show that it's safe, they don't have the desk, they don't have a fire extinguisher, does the employer have the right to say, you have to come to the office?
Again, I think most of these working from home arrangements are like beside, like, except during the pandemic when it was like no one was allowed, like you had to stay home. But now, since we're hopefully knocking on wood that we will never end up in the pandemic situation again, but these work from home arrangements are somewhat voluntary mostly. So you know, the employer may say, yes, you can do it, or not, or, you know, and then from that, they'd have to make sure that all the necessary arrangements are put into place.
Okay, and sort of just bouncing off of that last question, if there's a situation where the original, I guess, employment contract was that the employer had a physical office that the workers would work at, but since the pandemic, they've closed the office and now the workers can only work from home, is there then a requirement that the proper ergonomic, we'll say, equipment be provided to those workers to work from home?
So
If they
again,
don't have it themselves.
yeah, so again, everything goes back to the hazard assessment. So we identify all the hazards of working from home, and then we got to control those risks. So it's up to the employer to work with the employee to make sure that their work setup is in line with the Occupational Health and Safety Act and regulations. So, but again, it's okay if we don't have a smoke alarm, so what else can we do to mitigate the risks of being a fire in the house kind of thing, right? So it's not really a easy answer, but again, the employer has. Yeah, so if the again, we can't say to the employer, you gotta allow them to take their furniture from their old workplace into their new setup. So it's basically up to the employer and the employee and the occupational safety committee worker rep or designate to ensure that the proper hazard assessment is done. And whatever they gotta do to reduce the risks from those hazards, they gotta do. So like there's a whole section, I think section 54 of the regulations, it deals with MSI prevention. And so again, that's not, it all goes back to the hazard assessment.
I'm being told that that's all the time we have today. So if you guys do have any additional questions, feel free to email them to safety@workplacenl.ca, and we can compile them into a frequently asked questions document that we can work on and share. Thank you for sticking it out with us today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the symposium.